15th of September, 1940. The sky above London was a bruise of smoke and flame. Black puffs tracked like wounds across a low iron-grey ceiling. The Thames gleamed between columns of ash. Men below counted the seconds between the engines and the explosions. Captain Johannes Steinhoff watched a solitary silhouette through his gun sight and smiled thinly. In the cramped cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf-109, the DB-601V growled, oil warm on his palms. "A pretty toy," he said into the RT. "I'll take a collection of them today." His voice held the smooth arrogance of a pilot who had seen victory dressed in polished metal. Below Steinhoff's mocking radio, Spitfire P731 Stinks sat in its small bubble of light. Douglas Bader's gloved fingers tightened on the stick. He tapped the aluminum of his prosthesis once, a private ritual, and felt the clamp of his harness bite into his chest. The Merlin engine ahead was a living thing. It thumped, compressed air and life into the sheet metal lungs. 8 Browning 303s waited in the wings like a row of hungry teeth. Each one fired 303-inch rounds, roughly 7.7 millimeters, at a rate that made tracers blur. The ammunition belts rattled in their boxes. Ground crews at Biggin Hill had polished barrels and fingers stained with grease. The guns would roar in unison when called. The Spitfire's elliptical wings sliced the air. RJ. Mitchell's lines were not ornament but advantage. Roll rate, response, a turn that pulled the Merlin and pilot into the sky, as if the machine and man shared a single breath. Bader felt the craft answer him like a horse knowing the hands of its rider. Steinhoff judged angle and closure, expected the graceful fatal pass he had rehearsed over occupied France. He misread one thing. The Spitfire would not flee. "Bandit at 6 o'clock diving," crackled an Allied voice. He laughed into the air, sure of his metal and his guns. Bader smelled oil and leather and the metallic tang of fear. He remembered the clinic, the wooden peg replaced by polished aluminium. Flesh had once told him where strength lived. Now it was a memory. Yet in that memory there was also a stubborn grin from a boy who had refused to be left behind. The first volley lit the sky. The Browning batteries answered as one, a ribbon of fire that cut through cloud. Impact sounded like a new element being created. Metal shearing, a howl of airflow altered. Rounds streaked past the canopy, and the radio filled with shouted bearings and clipped facts. Steinhoff felt the first stutter in his control column. Something bit into his left wing, a hot, hungry tear that sent hydraulics leaking and sent instruments dancing. Metal folded like paper. The elegant silhouette of the Bf-109 lost a clean line and gained a ragged wound. Below, London reacted in the only way a city can. The ground exhaled, and sirens began their slow, mournful climb. Shelters filled. Children sat on coats, hearing engines as if they were the heartbeat of doom. Smoke fed the sky and stitched the horizon into ragged black lace. In the hangars at Biggin Hill, the mechanics heard the crackle of reports on the nets and felt the pull at the pit of them. They had tightened bolts all night, set prop pitch, and checked magnetos. Now they listened as their machines spoke back. A muffled cheer rose and fell with the static. In his cockpit, Bader's hands trembled from adrenaline and exhaustion. He watched Steinhoff's lead intake flutter and then bleed smoke. "You've got him," George Grumpy Unwin barked over the intercom. Bader did not answer. The silence was prayer and profession. His throat was dry. He tasted grit. Steinhoff wrestled with the controls that wanted to take him down. He was a man trained to beat the sky into submission, now learning a different vocabulary. The snap of ailerons gone heavy, the scream of a motor choking on lost oil. Pride turned to an animal, cunning and cold. He fought to keep his craft alive. When the engagement eased and metal cooled, Pilots on both sides catalogued the moment in the brief ledger of combat. Who had climbed, who had flinched, who had been merciless. For Douglas Bader there was no triumph without the shadow of cost. He thumbed a small photograph of a sister inside the cockpit, a reminder why he flew. The city below still burned. This is the story of how German pride collided with British steel, courage and engineering, and nothing would be the same. Summer 1940 smelled of petrol and defeat. France lay quiet under German boots, and a map in Berlin had a bold red plan stamped across the channel. Men at both ends of that map tightened their jaws and their timetables. At Biggin Hill the air tasted of hot aluminium. Violet Milner rested her palm along the Spitfire's elliptical wing and felt the smooth curve that R.J. Mitchell had drawn into the metal. She polished trailing edges with a rag and whispered, as if urging the airframe itself, "Make her sing." The Rolls-Royce Merlin V12 sat like a caged beast behind the cowling. When it ran, it thrummed through ribs and boots, immense piston-driven life. The supercharger sang under load, and the whole machine coughed and answered like a living throat. Mechanics checked magnetos and ignition timing, moved prop pitch and bled fuel lines. Browning 303 ammunition belts were counted twice. Rotol hub inspected. They spoke in clicks and numbers, timing, compression, carburetor float setting, each figure a prayer. Down in London, doors were braced and cellars stacked. Women nailed boards, men hammered sandbags into place. Sirens practiced their slow climb, and the city learned to live in the interval between engine noise and impact. At Bentley Priory, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding stood over the filter room and watched paper counters march across plotting tables. Chain home screens gleamed with ghostly returns. A line of metal masts off the Kent coast bled into cotton-grey horizon, distance measured in blips and seconds. "Keep the reserves," Dowding said, voice low and exact. Group Captain Keith Park, responsible for the Southern Ring, only nodded. The words were not orders so much as a law. Conserve pilots. Conserve experience. The radar operators called vectors in clipped tones. Bandits, bearing 180, altitude 15,000. Plotters moved counters, the map lit by a lamplight that could not warm nerves. Detection came hours, no minutes, before sight. Technology had bought the RAF a margin of time. From the French coast, the Luftwaffe massed Heinkel, He-111s and Dorniedo 17s, their bellies full of bombs and their formations neat as sewing. Bf-109s rode their flanks with DB-601 engines barking. Confidence had a sound. It was a German motor at full throttle. Back at Biggin Hill, the scramble bell cut through conversation. "Scramble! Scramble!" The young pilot on the line felt his heart slam to the rhythm of the Merlin restarting. He shoved on goggles. He tasted copper and guilt and the precise, ridiculous urge to fly into danger. Violet's hands trembled only once. She had patched a wing route at dawn and sent the Spitfire out with a final twist on a bolt. She thought of a brother at sea and of a name sewn on a flying suit. Courage here was grease under nails. The controllers fed squadrons into the sky like chessmen. Dowding's system did not hurl everything at once. It held back a column of steel for the surge. Vector here, altitude change there. It was a war of gradients and timing, not just of bullets. In the radio rooms, reports came like weather. 2 groups crossing Dover, heading northwest. Static ate half the sentence. A voice cracked, "We have visual, heavy escort." The room exhaled, then pinched itself tighter. There was always the cost ledger to weigh. Pilots climbed through a thin blue that quickly thickened with fuel and flak. The Merlin reeled out power and the air pressed at their faces behind helmets. Fear lived in the throat and the teeth. Discipline fed it to attention. Each man kept a private ledger, the names of those he would not let die. The storm assembled not in thunderheads, but in metal and wire and will. On the ground, a woman with oil on her knuckles finished a last check. On the map, Dowding's counters waited. In the channel, formations formed. Machines were ready, men were ready. The world seemed to hold a breath and wait for the strike. They worked in a cathedral of canvas and spar, the hangar at dawn smelling of petrol and hot metal. R.J. Mitchell's lines lived in every curved rib. Engineers ran fingers along the elliptical wing and saw the drawing in 3 dimensions. The shape was a promise, roll and radius folded into sheet steel and sweat. Joan Hughes stood at the wing root with a torque wrench and a ledger. She did not speak the poetry of design. She spoke numbers. No, 3 spar, 40 foot-pounds. Check the rivet line. Hands stained with oil, she bent to the splice plate as if it were a wounded thing that would bleed if mishandled. The Rolls-Royce Merlin idled like a great animal at rest. Its V12 heart breathed through a supercharger and a pair of SU carburetors. The vibration threaded through boots and bone. Mechanics listened for valve clatter and for magnetos that missed. A healthy Merlin had a rhythm. An ailing one limped like a man with a broken ankle. Alan Deere ran his gloved thumb along a Browning 303 feed belt. 8 guns lived in those wings, belts of 303-inch ammunition, ball and tracer rounds stitched together. "Feels heavier than it looks," he muttered, tasting metal and the salt of his own fear. The trigger was a small, final lever for a life that already felt fragile. They counted parts like men accounting for loved ones. 2,400 pieces, the manifest of a fighter. Wing ribs, aileron horns, control cables, U-bolts. Many came back from the field patched with chewing gum ingenuity, olive tin welded to replace a bearing, canvas doped and nailed over a torn aileron. Improvised repairs saved lives and livelihoods. A rotol hub gleamed under a strip light, its constant speed mechanism waiting to bite into the air. Prop pitch could be altered for climb or dash. It was an argument between thrust and patience. Ground crews set the blades, checked the governor, spoke of the sweet spot where the engine would pull best heading into cloud. They set fuel mixtures and magneto timing with the precision of clockmakers. "Give her full advance on the left, 20 degrees on the right," Joan told a mechanic, adjusting spark plug gaps. The words fell like liturgy. Each turn of a screw was a commandment written against failure. The hangar was a chorus of small, decisive noises, a spanner dropping, a valve being seated, the soft exhale of compressed air. Pilots paced, helmet in hand. Bader's voice came over from a briefing. "Discipline kills panic. Hold the line." He had lost legs to the crash, but not the habit of keeping men steady. When a Merlin roared to life, it filled the world. Exhaust banged, prop wash kicked gravel, and the whole aircraft seemed to shiver as if testing the sky for weight. Pilots felt the shove in their backs. Mechanics felt the pressure in their palms. The noise was a prelude and a benediction. Alan brushed grease from his cheek and felt the tremor under his jaw sharpened to attention. He thought of home, of a mother folding linens, of a sister's laugh. Fear was a muscle he flexed and then learned to still. "I'll bring her back," he told no one. The sentence was a contract signed with breath. Joan closed the inspection hatch and touched the fabric of a repaired aileron, as if blessing it. She remembered a boy from the village who had gone to sea and had not returned. Her work was not heroics in speeches. It was bolts torqued to spec, fuel line clamps sealed, and a whispered hope before takeoff. They logged every change in ink and duty numbers, hours, serials, last maintenance. The ledger was a secular scripture. The last entry before a sortie often read like a last will. Ground crews scribbled shorthand and sealed control cables with a twist of wire as though sealing a promise. A young pilot taxied out, tailwheel snaking, Merlin coughing, and the ground crew held their breath as the throttle opened. The aircraft leapt forward, the prop slicing air into a roar, and for a second the hangar felt empty and enormous. Engines climbed and men watched the smoke trail like prayers. Joan watched the 4 Spitfires arc into the thin morning and felt a heat behind the eyes she tried to hide. She wiped oil across her cheek and said, almost to herself, "Bring them back." The words were small, a single human thing in a world of machinery. These were not machines without souls. They were crafted instruments, and the men who mended them had given names and stakes. In every tightened bolt and set timing of the Merlin there lived a pact. The aircraft would answer when called, and the men would do whatever it took to bring her home. That covenant held faster than metal. Summer sunlight lay thin over the Pas-de-Calais airfield, bleaching the painted noses of parked Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Mechanics leaned on wheel chocks and swapped stories as flame-polished DB-601s cooled, while a distant rumble marked the arrival of Heinkel He-111s and Dornier de 17s, their bellies already counted for bombs. Adolphe Galland walked the line with the easy arrogance of a man who believed metal could prove destiny. He touched a wing root where an MGFF cannon sat snug in its fairing and smiled. "She will dance," he said, voice steady into the RT. Inside the cockpit, the throttle quadrant waited. The DB-601V beneath the cowl promised somewhere near 1100 horsepower on high boost. Servicemen checked ammunition drums and belts. The heavy 20mm rounds for the MGFFs rattled in crates. The paired synchronized MG-17s in the cowl whispered of a faster, smaller, bitter bite. A loader named Otto counted rounds with fingers that smelled of oil. 200 apiece, maybe less if we get hot fights, he muttered, thinking of tracers and stress fractures. A brass laugh cut the morning, pilots trading jests and toasts. Galland raised a mug of weak coffee and declared over the frequency, "The Spitfires will be swept away in hours." The radio carried his certainty across the tarmac. Young men repeated the phrase like liturgy. Confidence breeds covenant. But confidence wore thin at the edges. Orders had come down from Goering himself. Long-range escorts, heavier formations, constant patrols. Engines would burn through fuel at cruise, and climb rates would be trimmed by the need to keep the Heinkels within range. Each order shaved minutes from the clock of combat where dogfighting lived. Fritz Keller checked his rear gun position, palms toughened by cord and cold metal. His Browning-type MG-15 might not be a cannon, but it was his responsibility to watch the vast, vibrating sky. He looked at the fuel gauge and felt a hollow of dread. Discipline kept him pinioned to the duty. Terror learned to wear uniform. The DB-601's direct fuel injection gave it an advantage in negative G maneuvers. The engine did not falter when the needle folded under stress. Pilots like Galland knew these small truths, how a motor would cough at certain RPMs, how supercharger boost settings altered climb ceilings. They logged them like prayers. A briefing unfolded under a canvas awning, maps pinned and stamps splattered, headings, altitudes, rendezvous points. Henschel-ordered timings showed crossings over the channel, the precise waypoints where fighters would peel off and the bombers would continue. The plan read like a machine schematic, careful, efficient, clinical. The young pilots tried to match the syllables of the plan with a private heartbeat. One smoothed his flying gloves and quoted Galland back to himself. "We are superior," he said aloud to chase the shiver from his spine. The words were a blade against doubt, but doubt persisted like a shadow on the fuel gauge. On the ramp, a Bf-109's propeller spun a lazy circle as ground crews warmed the DB-601. Little clouds of vapor rose from exhaust stacks, and the smell of benzol folded into the air. Mechanics listened for valve tick and roughness. A missed beat could mean lost lives over the channel. All discipline lived in those small sounds. A radio crackled with a different tone. Some commanders pushed for aggression, others for caution. Göring's voice was not present, but his hand pressed the day's tempo. More escort duty, deeper patrols. Galland's jaw tightened. He had to shape courage into calculation or risk sending men out with insufficient margin. Fritz swallowed and read the instruments again. Oil pressure, manifold pressure, boost gauge hovering at the top line. He felt the tension in the gut that comes before a door opens. Cold, metal, and relentless. His training hammered him to a discipline that flattened fear into reaction and execution. When the squadron climbed, the formation looked immaculate. Flaps trimmed, radiators half open to prevent overheating, pilot visors down. The Bf-109s reached for the sky, the DB-601s singing into a higher pitch. Speed accrued in a bright ribbon. Confidence rode the shockwave of acceleration. Yet as they crossed the channel, the thin arrogance of the morning began to flake. Radio reports spoke of radar picks earlier than expected. Met conditions nudged formations out of ideal positions. A Heinkel lagged and needed close escort. Minutes bled into precious time. The mask of certainty began to crack. Back on the ground, Otto folded his hands around a now empty ammo crate and watched the line of black specks shrink into the cloud line. He chewed a lip and whispered a small human prayer. Up there, Galland felt for the tail-end Charlie and for Fritz's guns. He was still a leader, still a man who would take the blame before a praise. Pride could be iron, but iron bends when pressure is patient. 15th of September 1940. The scramble bell at Biggin Hill split the morning like a gunshot. Men left oily palms on wheel chocks and climbed into narrow cockpits. Squadron 92 streamed toward the runway as if pulled by a single cord. Alan Deere slid behind the canopy and tasted petrol on his tongue. The Merlin V-12 came alive with a lurch and a prayer. Propwash rolled grit across the dispersal, the Rotol constant speed hub setting its blades for climb. Engines harmonized into a thundering chord, 1,000 horsepower answering 1,000 more in the sky. They climbed through a thin sheet of cloud and found London folded beneath a shawl of smoke. From below, people pressed their faces to cellar steps. Children pointed at bright explosions sketched between the clouds. Altimeters spun, and the world shortened to a ring of instruments and breath. A line of Heinkel He-111s wavered on the skyline, bellies kinked with bomb racks, flak-scarred and heavy. They moved like a slow tide, flanked by Messerschmitt Bf-109s, whose DB-601s screamed at high boost. The escorts carved arcs of black against the pale, fast, precise, menacing. Spitfires rolled hard and hard again, throwing ellipses into the air. Mitchell's wing did what the diagrams promised: an aggressive turn, a tight radius, an abrupt change of direction that made the Heinkel's stable belly an open target. Pilots dropped from above like hunting falcons. The Browning 303 sang in unison. 8 guns spat belts of 303-inch rounds. Ball and tracer, incendiary mixed into the feed, the tracers painting the sky with orange scars. The sound was a metallic drum, rat-a-tat, a staccato fury that cleaved air. A burst hit a Heinkel's starboard tank and the aircraft became a torch. Fuel fed the blaze, fabric and metal glowed. In a cockpit behind the glass, a radio voice cut off in a strangled cry. "Those toys! They're stalking us!" Galvanized fear replaced practiced calm. Over the channel the radio chatter tightened, then stilled as reports crashed through. Fighters down, formations broken. Later, tallies would read 56 lost in a single sweep. Now there was only the immediate count, burning wrecks carving black ribbons into the cloud. In his cockpit, Alan Deere felt the pressure in his chest like a fist. Sweat slicked the back of his neck. His fingers found the stick with reflex rather than thought. "Hold tight," he breathed to himself and to the man on his wing. The stick was weight. The plane obeyed. George Grumpy Unwin flew a whisper behind Deer and watched the chaos with an almost surgical calm. "Got your 6, Deer," he said over the wire, short and flat. He tossed into a covering turn, radiator flaps opening like small, deliberate breaths. Elsewhere, Douglas Bader wrenched his Spitfire into a reckless climbing scissors. Prosthetic thigh biting at the cockpit frame, he felt every vibration as if the aircraft spoke through metal. Fuel gauges fluttered near empty. His face tasted of soot, and a child's photograph taped to the panel. Below, London's shelters shook with each blast. Voices rose in fragments. A prayer, a cry, a hiss of someone trying to calm a small body. Children kept pointing at the sky where tracers cut the blue. Men and women learned the names of the engines they feared and the ones they loved. Pieces of the battle fell through the clouds like broken promises. Wings, a crumpled tail, a fuselage shedding a plume of black. Wreckage struck the river or housing, and the sound of impact told of lives ended. Ground crews stared north and read loss in the smoke. When the last combatants thinned and Spitfires drifted back toward the fields, men counted returns and counted names. Some aircraft that returned wept oil from torn seams. Some men returned gasping and grey with ash. Mechanics already bent over consoles, hands ready, ledger open. By dusk the sky cooled, but the day had been scorched into memory. Laughter on the German nets had turned to a hard, stunned silence. Douglas Bader stepped from his aircraft, hands black with depot dust, and let tears cut tracks through the soot on his face. That evening, pride had been humbled at the tips of wings and the mouths of Browning guns. Hitler slammed his fist onto the oak table at Wolfschanze, and the map on the table shuddered. Operation Sea Lion sat with its plans half-inked. A long-voiced order was scratched out. Officers around him swallowed their schedules like bitter pills. The pause tasted like failure. Heinz Knoker uncapped a fountain pen and wrote in a cramped hand he had never needed before. The words for the Spitfire had changed. The diary line read, in German and in heat, "The avenging angel over London." He paused, finger on the blot, and felt the weight of a metal shell that had not been there yesterday. In the gutters of a bombed terrace, children chased hollow brass. Tracer casings glinted like coins. A boy called Tommy kept a dented belt in a biscuit tin. A girl named Elsie braided the copper into a keepsake for a father who might yet come home. The 303 shells were small trophies and loud lessons. Douglas Bader walked the hospital ward like a captain moving among his men. He laughed, abrupt and bright, at a joke no one else could land. He put a gloved hand on a shoulder scarred by shrapnel and felt the voice inside him steady. "You'll fly again." The words were not a promise of iron, but of will. Mary Ellis, speaking from a waif plot room microphone, read sortie returns with a voice that broke twice. "Squadron 92, 8 airborne, 6 returned. 4 claims," she announced, and the room held like a lung. The radio reports named serial numbers and engine runs, Merlin serials, rotorprops, percent serviceability. Each figure carried a life. At Biggin Hill, the mechanics bent over Merlins like priests. Valve clearances were set to an exacthu. Magneto timing checked against a stroboscope's wink. Joan Hughes wiped her hands on a rag and said, "Get the boost right or don't send them up. No stories afterwards." The men answered with clicks of tools and a stubborn, tired assent. The Spitfire became a doctrine and a talisman at once. 8 Browning 303s in the wings meant rapid, wide-sweeping fire. The Merlin V-12 supercharger pushed climbs beyond what many expected. Pilots spoke of roll rate and turn radius as if they were scripture. P-7316 and others bore names and battle scars like medals. Heinz Knoker read intercepted German net reports and underlined the shift in tone. The cocky cadence of earlier messages had snapped into urgent pragmatism. Adolf Gallen's earlier braggadocio gave way to clipped tactical notes. The machines still purred, but the edges of confidence had dulled. On street corners, women mended uniforms and patched curtains to dim the light. A seamstress named Margaret took cartridges and flattened them into badges for boys who would wear them like medals. The city learned to make memory into practical things: lists, ration cards, and small brass relics. Bader bent low over a wounded pilot whose hands were gone at the wrist. He drew a laugh from the man with a crooked joke, and then steadied him with a steadier one. "Remember the drill, thumb to top," he coached, meaning nothing more than to keep him occupying the task of surviving. Discipline was the bridge between fear and functioning. Mary Ellis and the WAF girls logged sorties into a ledger that smelled of ink and rubbed fingertips. Chain home reports met aircrew debriefs, and the numbers were checked twice. "We can't put them up without spares," one teletype operator said. The maintenance and the maps were as important as the courage above the clouds. Mechanics who had touched the fabric of every returning aircraft remembered faces. They could name a Spitfire by a bent rivet or a smear of soot. When a Merlin returned with a cracked exhaust flange, they did what they could in an hour. Jury-rigged a clamp, tightened the manifold, checked the oil. Their hands were quick and their minds even quicker. At dusk, the newspapers printed the lists and the parlor radios hummed with the new epithets. The Germans called the Spitfire an avenging angel in private notes. Londoners called it the thin-winged defender. Choirs in local halls learned hymns that contained the names of squadrons and the engines that sang victory. The victory tasted of burnt oil and 100 small griefs. Hitler's orders withered. The invasion timetable frayed at the edges. But the Blitz would come to the city in a darker, longer cadence. Men who had seen the sky clenched their teeth and understood the bargain. The day had been won in the air, but the war would demand everything still left to give. On a cold evening in a hospital yard, Douglas Bader watched a Spitfire stitch its contrail across the last light. He drew a breath that fogged with fatigue and smiled, a private, brittle thing. He knew the sky had been defended, but he also knew that men were different now. The engine's roar had shifted history, gentle and terrible. The next pages would be written in fire and steel,